Well, my name is Monk Rowe, and I'm here at the Hotel Utica with Vibraphonist Peter Appleyard. Welcome to Utica.
Thanks, Monk. Before we go any further, how did you get the name Monk?
Aha! You've turned the tables on me. Actually, it was because of a big, long blue coat I used to wear with a hood on it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and someone said, "You look like a monk with that thing on." And it stuck. Yeah.
That's similar to the moniker that Zoot Sims adopted.
How did he get that, do you know?
Well, I think he was playing in this school band, and they had the music stands, their old music stands, and they had the names of the guys on the music stands. They're either their real name or a pseudonym or whatever. And he said Zoot. It stayed with him.
Great. Well, I'm glad to have you here for this concert at Hamilton College, and I've been thinking of some things I wanted to ask you about. You're from England.
Yes,
You know.
I was born in a place called Grimsby
Mm-hmm.
on the east coast of England. It was the largest commercial fishing port in England. And I was born there on the Tuesday, and I didn't like it. They moved me on the Wednesday down to a place called Cleethorpes, which was adjacent to it, a seaside resort.
No kidding.
And I lived there till I first went on the road, I think when I was 16, 17.
Mm-hmm. And you were a teenager during World War II.
Yes, I was, yeah.
What do you remember about that time?
I remember that I slept in an air raid shelter for 3 consecutive years. The first year I was evacuated to Wales because we were vulnerable being a port.
Oh.
And they brought me back. Nothing much happened for the first year, so they brought me back, and it started to a certain extent. I remember once seeing a flying bomb coming,
The V1, the V2s?
No, they came too fast. This was a buzz bomb, they called them.
Oh.
It was like a small jet plane. Something like the drones that you're seeing today, yeah. And then Hitler decided that he could demoralize the Londoners with his bombing, so he moved up to the provinces. And ours was one town where they experimented with a new anti-personnel bomb called a butterfly bomb. And they would drop it, and it was about the size of a hand grenade, and it was as potent as a hand grenade. But when it fell, it triggered a hairspring. Didn't explode, but if you walked within 6 feet of it, it would blow up and kill you. I left school when I was 13, public school, and in those days in Britain, you had to pay for a child's secondary education, high school.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my parents were victims of the recession, and consequently they couldn't afford to do that. And so they acquired me an apprenticeship for a compass adjuster and nautical instrument maker.
A compass adjuster?
Yeah. We would take a ship out into the River Humber, which was about 3 miles wide, and we'd take a bearing and say that was true north. And in those days, the compass was not magnetic. They would work with magnets. And adjust accordingly the various magnets and what have you to bring it truthfully into line, true north. I was doing that for about 2 years, and on one occasion I had to go and pick up some Admiralty charts, not music charts, regular Admiralty charts for the British Navy. They used to have corvettes and this type of vessel there to circumvent the British minefields to get out into the North Sea. Well, this 20-minute errand used to turn out to be an hour's adventure for me, because on the way to the Admiralty there was a record shop. And I always used to stop in there and audition some records, which you could do in those days. You could take 3 or 4 records and go and listen to them, and come back and say, I'd like to have this one, so. So this day, here I am in this record shop, listening to probably a Benny Goodman sextet record, and I was tapping away with some drumsticks. Meantime, the Royal Navy's waiting to go to sea, and the Admiral was saying, where the hell are those charts? We're losing the time. And anyway, this door opens, this fellow with a big mustache, and it was an ex-RAF type, as a matter of fact. And he said, say, old chap, do you play the drums? I said, yeah. Well, he said, our drummer got caught in bed with another woman last night by his wife, and she promptly took the fire axe off the wall and chopped up his drums. I say he was pretty lucky. And if you'd like to come down to the Palace Theatre on Saturday morning and audition for Felix Mendelssohn's Hawaiian Serenaders, it was an Alvina Ray type band, come down. So I went down with my drum set, because I was playing drums then, and I got the job. As a compass adjuster's apprentice, I was earning 7 shillings and 6pence a week, which in those days was like, it was like $1. Mr. Mendelssohn offered me 17 pounds a week. So guess what I did? It was rather a difficult decision because I was in love with a beautiful girl, and it meant leaving her, and I thought, oh, shall I do this? And then it occurred to me, I thought about it, and I spoke to my parents, of course, and they said, well, you should try it and see how it works. Those were the days when vaudeville theaters had big bands as their attraction. Ours was the #1 band in Britain. We were the first band on British television. We broadcast from the Crystal Palace, which is not there anymore. And we made a film for Pathé, and we traveled all around the country. I did that for about 6 months, and then I was conscripted into the Royal Air Force.
Did you have band experience before you went with them?
Yes, I studied with a drummer who used to let me sit next to him, and he was playing with a Artie Shaw type big band. So this was a great opportunity for me. And occasionally he would take off and sub. And eventually he retired, I think. And I got the job. Prior to that, I was working in a cinema with a little band prior to the movies. And the drummer, cycling home one night, saw one of these butterfly bombs, walked up to it and killed him.
No kidding.
Yeah. So that's,
I was going to ask about that if you knew anybody that had
one night they got
encountered
3,000 of these things on our town, and incendiary bombs to boot as well. And then that was basically the bulk of the bombing. I guess that as we started to move into Germany and with the Second World War, the invasion.
What do you remember about VE Day?
I remember dancing on the street.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Everyone was kissing everybody, and we were all dancing, and we went crazy. I remember the day that they invaded, too, with the invasion.
Mm.
I was on the dock still working as an apprentice compass adjuster. I was 45, wasn't it?
1945, yeah. And what was your job in the service?
Well, once they found out I was a musician, they sent me home to get my drums, which was great because I wanted to see that lovely girl. And I had a weekend's leave and got back, and it was a military band. And when it came time for me to be demobilized, I had to do 18 months. Everyone, it was mandatory because we still were under the War Measures Act. We're having all that trouble with the Russians with Berlin. You remember the air support we gave all the Berliners. The warrant officer, who was a real bad one, sent for me. He said, "Oh, so Appleyard, you're being demobbed." I said, "Yes." Well, he said, "If you'd like to sign on for 5 years, he said, I'll make you a sergeant." I said, "Oh, I don't think so." He said, "There's going to be another war, and I can't guarantee you'll get back in the band." I said, "I'll take my chances." So I'm leaving, and he said, "Oh, by the way, Appleyard, you'll never make it in music." So anyway, about 15 years ago, the wing commander in charge of all the bands of the Royal Air Force came over to Toronto to play a concert in the big band shell. And guess who was the other band? Me.
Aw. Nice story.
So anyway, he was one of those snobby kind of guys. He was a wing commander, and he had to share my dressing room, you see. Oh, he says, "I ought to chop you in the Air Force, were you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What rank were you?" I said, "I was a leading aircraftsman." And I said, "I was attached to the #1 regional fighter command band, 11 group." "Oh, jolly old Wheeler, good chap." I said, "Yeah, when you see him, tell him I'm still struggling to make it."
That's a good one.
And by the way, move that stuff off my dressing room table.
Yeah. You know, you don't have a very distinctive English accent,
I don't.
to my ears, anyway.
This is funny you say this, because where I come from, their dialect, or whatever you would call it, accent, is very broad. Like, for instance, if I'd grown up around there, I'm sure that I would have adopted it. I go back, and I can hear my accent slipping into that way of speaking. But it's funny, about 4 years ago, I went back and I invited my 4 cousins to come to see me play, who had never seen me play. And so one of them, Brian, said to me, "Here, what happened to your accent? You don't talk like us anymore. You're talking posh now." I said, "Brian, I've been gone for 50, 60 years, living with Canadian people, and married to a Canadian girl, and consequently, if I haven't deliberately tried to lose my accent, well, I can't understand what you're saying anymore."
He said you were talking what?
Posh. Posh. Well, in Britain, it's like in the line of My Fair Lady. They're singing, and the Professor Higgins says, "You can always identify an Englishman the minute he opens his mouth. You can immediately identify him." It's like there still is, to a certain extent, class distinction there. If you go to a proper school, I say, "Old chap, you'll be actually, old boy, and jolly good show." This kind of an accent. Yeah. It's sort of a sophisticated accent, which comes probably with the schools and the exposure that these people get. And maybe that type of an Englishman, like ultra rich or whatever, has this accent. And it immediately identifies him, that he went to a good college, and so consequently, in comes this little bit of prejudice,
So parch, how do you spell that? Parch, I'm not sure what the word was that you used. You're speaking,
Posh. P-O-S-H.
Oh, posh.
That's like some rich
Posh.
person.
I understand.
Yeah.
Okay, posh.
But anyway, I've survived. And,
Yes.
I go back, and they can still understand
Okay.
me.
Well, I wanted to ask you, I read this little anecdote. I guess you were en route from Bermuda to Canada or something, and you had a stop in New York.
It was going to Bermuda.
Going to Bermuda, and
from England.
And you happened to see Lionel Hampton.
Yes, we flew over on BOAC, and we got behind, and consequently they put us up at the Gotham Hotel, 55th and 5th Avenue. They don't do that anymore. And I'd never been to North America. All I could remember in my lifetime was rationing. Couldn't buy clothes, couldn't buy candies. You only got an ounce and a quarter of meat every a week or something or other. It was pretty bad. And when I got this offer from the same chap, I say, "Oh boy, you play the bloody drums." He wrote me this letter, because we didn't have a telephone, couldn't get a telephone during the war. Would you be interested in an 18-month contract in Bermuda with a possibility of a stay over in New York? I said, oh my God, yeah. So anyway, we get to New York, and they ushers us down to the Gotham, which was at 55th and 5th Avenue, not bad. And we only had $25 between us because of the currency restrictions. I think we had $5 each. In those days, it was very difficult. The war had just finished, and it was finished a couple of years. It was Christmas 1949. So we walked down 55th toward Broadway, not knowing where we were going, and I see this sign, Bop City, Doug Duke at the organ, the George Shearing Quintet, and Lionel Hampton and his orchestra. I said, guys, we've got to go in. I said, we don't have the money. Well, let's see how much it is. I think it was $2 to go in. Anyway, we all went in, and I heard him play that night. I'd seen him on the movies before, you know. He'd been my inspiration in England. He was the only vibraphone player I was aware of until 1946, when I was walking through a Woolworth store and I heard this Benny Goodman record of slip disc, and it was Red Norvo with Slam Stewart and that wonderful group. So that was it, and I went back to Bermuda, and once I got enough money together, I took a vacation up in New York, and I bought a larger vibraphone because mine was very tiny.
Oh.
Actually, I'll tell you this very briefly story about the vibraphone and how I got attached to it. During the war, I used to go out and entertain the troops at various stations. As a matter of fact, I played several USOs over there at the time. I remember once I went in, there was a brand new set of Sling-a-Lang drums with big cymbals, and I couldn't believe it. I thought, geez, I've got to get to America. I've really got to get to America. Anyway, this night we were playing this aerodrome, and it was a very large aerodrome. And this guy came out. I was playing drums in this accordion band, and this guy came out, little tiny vibraphone. He starts to tap with one hand, and he had a flatbed guitar, and he put an electric motor in it with plectrums on a wheel, hitting one string, going, and he'd slide a steel up and down there, and he'd play arpeggiated chords with the violins. But the war was on, you know. So anyway, I went up to him after that. I said, Mr. Blakey, that's quite an instrument. I said, can I try it? He said, yeah, sure, go ahead. So I got these. There's a cute girl standing here, and she said, you sound good on that. I thought, aha, I should be playing this, right? Anyway, I said, would you sell me it? He said, no, I can't do that. I said, well, all right, if you ever want to sell it, let me know, you know. So the war ended, and a knock came at my door. It was just Mr. Blakey. He said, you still want to buy the vibraphone? I said, yeah. He said, £15. Now, I was still working as a compass adjuster's assistant, so £15 is king's ransom. I knew a guitarist who played in the big band with me, and I asked him to loan me the money. I borrowed the money, and I bought it. My father was furious.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't do that in those days, you know. Don't buy anything on time. If you can't afford it, don't buy it. So I bought it. About 15 years ago, we went back, and I went to look this man up, Mr. Blakey. He was still alive. He said, I'm going to tell you something now I couldn't tell you before. He said, do you remember when we played those aerodromes? I never came home with you. I said, Mr. Blakey, it was 60 years ago, you know. But now you mention it, because we used to go on bikes. No, you didn't, as a matter of fact. He said, well, I'll tell you why I'm telling you now. I was a British spy. And the vibraphone was to cover me to get on the aerodrome without being suspected by a possible German spy or sympathizers to Germany on the airport. I mean, you couldn't say anything to him. There were signs everywhere. Be like Dad, keep mum. Walls have ears.
Be like Dad, keep mum.
Yeah.
Oh,
Mum.
yeah.
I said, what did you do? Well, he said, after the concert, they put me in a single-engine aircraft with a pilot and fly me behind the German lines in France. This is just prior to the audition. The invasion, rather. And they'd shut the engine off about a mile before predetermined field, and the Maquis would guide us down with flashlights. And we'd glide in, and I'd exchange information with the Maquis, the French resistance, pertaining to what have you seen, what are the Germans doing, blah, 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 blah. I said, Mr. Blakey, how many times did you do that? Oh, he said, at least 12 times. And you know, if you get caught, it's fatal. You get shot, spy.
And the Vibes were his cover, huh?
Yeah.
That's really great story. And what was the French resistance was called? The
The Maquis.
Maquis.
Yeah.
Wow. That's really neat. How, that's a really great story. How big were the Vibes? Like
Two octaves.
2 octaves?
2 octaves, yeah.
Yeah. And you would ride your bike home
Yeah.
from the gig.
And then my father made a trailer, wooden trailer for me to put the drums in. And then when I bought the Vibes, now I had, you know, we used to deliver groceries, and they had a basket sort of on front of and they had them in a little box on the front, you know, so I'm back.
Oh,
And I started out playing waltzes on them with the big band. you
I
know.
see.
Then eventually I moved to a smaller band and started to work at it.
Yeah. No, I wish there was a picture of you with your bike and your drums and your Vibes, you know. Were you playing mostly by ear?
Mostly
By ear? When you started
Oh, yeah.
doing the Vibes?
nobody
Because,
to teach me.
yeah. So you
So
didn't.
what I did, I was taking piano lessons.
Okay.
I adopted the right hand of the piano, all the exercises and what have you. and
Hmm.
Basically taught myself
Yeah.
by listening to Hampton, really. And then when Red came along, listened to Red. And then there was one guy that played, there was Art Van Dam.
Hmm.
He was a good player. I started to hear a few of his records, and I think there was a group called the Mary Mac Singers. They had a vibraphone player.
Yeah.
It wasn't very popular. You know, it wasn't heard that much, and it's like today it's almost becoming an endangered species,
Hmm.
which is unfortunate.
Were records back then a precious commodity? Excuse me. I mean, were they precious?
Yeah, they were, and they were expensive for a guy like me. The first record I bought was In the Mood, because there was a Glenn Miller, which was on whatever it was on, Columbia or RCA, and I couldn't afford that. I had to buy the English version of it by a band called Joe Loss, which was a shilling cheaper.
No kidding.
Da ba da ba da ba da ba da da da, you know. But yeah, I forget how much they cost, but if you bought the record, you couldn't take the girl to the movies, you know.
You had to have your priorities in
Yeah.
order, I guess. And they were 78s, right?
78.
Yeah. Well, so why Canada?
Why?
Why?
Well, actually, it was a girl, I guess, originally that sort of got me up there. I met this girl in Bermuda, and we got pretty serious. And she left, and I went up to see her. And I liked the country, and I didn't feel I was ready for New York, you know.
Mhm.
And whilst I was up there to visit this girl at the Colonial Tavern, which is a very famous jazz club there, Red Norvo was playing with his trio, with Tal Farlow and Charlie Mingus. And so I met him, and they invited me to go down to Rochester with them. Mingus was out of it. He said, "Oh, drive me down in my Cadillac." I said, "You kidding? I've never driven here." "Oh, you can do it. Get in my Cadillac and drive." I said, "But I don't have a driving license for this place. I've got one for Bermuda." "Ah, damn." And I said, No, I'll come down on the bus." So I went down on the bus. And they played this hotel, which was similar to this one, in Rochester. And it was so great. He had that trio with Red. I mean, he was a genius when it came to playing. It was incredible.
Red?
Norvo.
No. Yeah.
4 mallets.
Right. Uh-huh.
And his sound, you know, was so beautiful. He took, they have pulsators in the resonators, you know, to give
Yeah.
it a vibrato. He removed them. He wouldn't use
didn't
them.
like
And got that flat, beautiful, crystal-like sound. Yeah.
That was a trio without a drummer, wasn't it?
That was the trio, yeah.
Was it Tal Farlow or somebody on guitar?
Guitars
Yeah.
and Mingus.
Right. So you liked Canada, and you found
so
work?
I went back, and after I finished my 18 months in Bermuda, I went back home to England, and I told my parents that I wanted to emigrate, you know. I couldn't see any future in England. I was sitting in this old radio, old railway carriage, and it looked so depressing and everything. And I think I'll give it a try. And so I went back. The thing didn't work out with the girl. And when I went to join the union, it was an ex-Brit there. And he said, oh, where did you come from? I said, well, I came from England, but I was in Bermuda working. You shouldn't have been working there. I said, what do you mean I shouldn't? He said, that's American Federation of Musicians territory. I said, well, when I accepted the gig in England on Wardour Street, I said, I knew nothing about that. I just went there to work. He said, go away and don't come back for a year and don't play a note.
Man, that's tough.
So I wanted to join the union, and I knew I couldn't get started. In those days, if they caught you sitting in, they'd fine you a whole bunch of money. It was terrible. They got rid of that particular group of union people.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost like the Spanish Inquisition, you know. Anyway, I got a job as an elevator operator in the biggest hotel, but I got elevator sick because the damn thing would go up and down. I get people caught in the doors. Then I was working selling sporting goods and tobacco in a big department store. Then I went from there to a room clerk at the King Edward Hotel, which is a fancy hotel, and I stuck that out, but it was nights, 11 at night till 8 in the morning, and I did it for about 6 months. But I was determined. I never even thought about going on welfare, you know, like a lot of people do today, because it was a disgrace in England to go on the dole. You wouldn't do it.
Oh.
And then I wound up working in a shirt shop, and the guy that owned it happened to be a runner for Al Capone.
Bringing booze over the border.
Yeah. Milt Hinton used to do that.
I heard that.
Yeah. He was a driver, or assistant. Anyway, I got into this nice clothing store, and around about the time, after about 3 or 4 weeks, I got my union card, and I got a gig in a bar, and I had to do a Saturday matinee, you see. Oh, how the hell am I going to get away to do this matinee on a Saturday with a clothing store, you know? So I told my manager, he said, Peter, take your lunch from 3 to 4, and if Harry asks where you are, I'll say you've gone off on an errand from 4 to 5. You see, the place wasn't very far away. I could whip and green. So I pulled this off for about 3 weeks, and Harry he looked like George Raft. Remember George Raft? Black hair. Mm-hmm. He looked like a gangster, you see. Dressed so smart. He'd stand there, and if he was doing this much, he was really animated, you know. So I came in this Saturday, and he was up, he said, where do you go on a Saturday afternoon? I said, Mr. Field, I've got to tell you, I'm a musician, and I do this matinee. I've really waited a year for the union card, and I would appreciate, I'm awfully sorry, anything I can do with some extra hours, all I said. What time do you finish at night? I said, 1 in the morning. Oh yeah, and you have to drive up to North Toronto. That's 2 o'clock by the time you get to bed, and you've got to get up at 7 to get here. And then he said, why don't you come in executive hours? Come in at 10 in the morning and take Saturday afternoons off. I thought, then he's going to say, yeah, and don't do it on my time, you're fired. And then he said to me, and if it doesn't work out, Peter, you've still got a job here.
Oh, that's just great.
Nice, huh?
Nice.
I never forgot that.
Yeah. You've had an interesting combination of running into people that, were tough on you, and some people who sort of very serendipitously helped you out. Yeah. The part about absorbing jazz in your playing, was it mostly through listening to records?
Yeah.
Okay.
Nobody would teach me. The only person that was playing vibes then was a man called Roy Marsh, and he was working with one of these big bands. It was Eric Winston's big band, and 3 or 4 of the guys in the band, they came to the theater to play, and 3 or 4 of them came down to hear me play at this little ballroom when I was working in the small group and playing vibes on the side. And I asked Roy Marsh if he would teach me then. He said no, he wouldn't teach me. So I had to make my own way, and I really wasn't of professional caliber until I spent every day practicing in Bermuda all the time I was there. And I formed a trio there with a couple of the local guys, a couple of African American kids.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a very nice trio, and so that was good experience. And the guy let me play the odd number in the band I was playing for the dancing. In those days, in 1950-51 in Bermuda, in the winter, you had to come to the ballroom to dance in a dinner jacket, and the ladies had to wear long dresses.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was very formal. But it was a good experience. I enjoyed it. It was 7 nights a week for 18 months.
Wow.
No night off. And on the Sunday, we had to do a concert. So I'd always do a vibraphone solo, you know. So that helped me to get developed.
If someone asked you, they came up and said, can you play These Foolish Things,
Yeah.
for instance, and you didn't know it, but you said, I better learn that song, how did you go about it back then?
I would learn the melody, and then I got a fake book. Some guy on a boat, was an American fellow, had this fake book, and I bought it. It was a good fake book with just elementary changes,
Mm-hmm.
but it gave me the direction.
Yeah.
And then I kept, I would pick up this lick and that lick, and I probably played a lot of melody more than jazz.
Mm. Yeah. Well,
But I always liked playing melody.
yeah, melody's good.
Yeah, I made a beautiful record with strings some years ago. Rick Wilkins, the great arranger that used to arrange for the Boss Brass, did the arrangements for me, and it really was a nice record. And it was at the time when we would get airplay on the FM stations, you know. So I got a lot of play.
Did you happen to work with either guitar players or piano players along the way that really helped you with understanding the chord changes and all that?
Yes, this fellow that loaned me the money in England. Another interesting story. How's your film? Have you got?
Yeah, we're good.
You're okay?
Yeah.
He loaned me this £15. Whilst I was in Bermuda, the bass player left. So the band leader said to me, he said, "You know a bass player?" I said, "Yeah, well, I know this guitar player that plays bass. He's a good guitar player, and he's not a bad bass player." He said, "What kind of a guy is he?" Because they were always concerned about the personality, bringing somebody out all that way, you know. I said, "Oh, I know him. He's very quiet." I said, "But he won't cause any trouble." He said, "Well, all right." So anyway, out he comes. And he used a lot of wandering around Bermuda, and I went to the movies once, and it was a movie about, I think it was the Third Man theme or something or other, and he said it's not really like that, and he was sort of critical of it, and anyway, I left to come to Canada, and shortly afterwards I left. One night they're playing on the bandstand, and these two big guys came right in and said, "You Lenny Stewart?" "Yes." "Follow us." Handcuffs, took him out. He was a roaring communist, and he was trying to build a cell in Bermuda while he was there. They'd been intercepting his mail. Talk about the situations, huh? And anyway, I never saw him. I think he went to jail. And some years afterwards, I was playing with Peanut Succo in England, and in Sheffield, and he walked in. I didn't know what to say to him. He said, "Good to see you." I said, "Yeah."
Yeah.
"How are you?" You know.
How's the communism going? Gee.
But during the time of the war, the Russians at the beginning were our enemies, of course, as you remember. Then they came on our side after Hitler invaded them. And all of a sudden, I find myself playing at a communist meeting one night. You know, and it was this drummer, who I had no idea was a communist. He said, "We're going to play this gig for these people I'm in this group with." I said, "Yeah." We go there, and there's a big Russian flag on the tree. But anyway, I mean, the war was on our side, and we had Russian prisoners in my town, and they let them all out, and they would gather in the streets and sing a cappella. Oh, it was so beautiful, some of these voices. But that was the war, but that was the story about the guy with the...
She.
Yeah, they took him right, and they didn't even get him take his clothes. They left the base on the stand and took him out and put him on an airplane right away.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it was great, and then of course I came back, and before I left England, I had a job at a place called the Isle of Wight, and all the liners would go by there heading for New York. And I'd sit on the beach looking at these boats and oh God, if I could only get on one of those as a gig, so I could go to New York. And here I am now all of a sudden, a job in Bermuda with stop off in New York, which was great. Then, after I got my union card, I left the shop selling ties and everything and shirts, and I got a job in the Colonial Tavern where I saw Red. There was 2 levels. We were on the bottom level, and the big shots were on the 2nd level. Everyone came. Duke. Oh gosh. Every major star. Tatum, Billie Holiday, the Basie Band, the Hampton Band. And I got to know them all because in their break they come downstairs and have a taste and listen to us, you see. And if the band came in, they'd always do 2 weeks. And so what we would do is to have a weenie roast or whatever, spaghetti night, and invite them all over. So the room is filled with Ray Nance, Clark Terry, Duke Ellington, and I mean, Duke, I knew him as, intimately as I know you basically now. And the last time I saw him, I was with Benny at the Rainbow Grill in the Rockefeller Center, and I went to the stage delicatessen, and Harry Carney, the baritone player, was sitting there. Hey, Peter, how are you? I said, Harry, how are you? He said, what are you doing working here? I said, yeah, I'm with Goodman. He said, oh, great. I said, were you working with Duke tonight? Because he had a nice suit. And he said, yeah. I said, how is he? He says, right over there at the takeout counter. And Duke lived upstairs, and he was an ice cream junkie. He was standing at the takeout counter with a robe on. It looked like he'd had since 1917. No socks on, slippers, in this sophisticated restaurant in the middle of New York. And he turned around and saw me and he said, ah, Mr. Appleyard, and gave me such yeah.
Oh, great.
So that was fortunate working at the Colonial because everyone worked there, all the greats, and I can't even remember. Artie Shaw came. Goodman didn't come while I was there, but I can't remember Errol Garner, everybody.
Yeah. So you got to know them as personalities as well as musicians.
Yeah.
How to behave, how to carry yourself.
Shearing came. And you asked me, did a guitar player help me?
Yeah.
Toots was with him then. Toots
Thielman's, wow.
And he was awfully kind to me because the vibraphone player, Johnny Ray, was leaving. And so he said, well, why don't you audition for George? And I said, I don't know, because prior to Johnny, a vibraphone player being with him, I'm just trying to think of his name, and George wasn't too generous in those days as regards them playing. He would give them 8 bars here and 8 bars there, that kind of thing. So this guy came for my dinner this night, to my house for dinner, and he said, wait till I get home, wait till I get to the gig tonight, I'm going to screw George. He said, we're going to do Jordu, we always play it to start off, and he said, I'm going to take 6 choruses, and George is doing this, and this, he became the biggest percussionist in Hollywood. Oh, he made a fortune.
Not Emil Richards.
Emil. Yeah, it was Emil.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, I haven't seen him all those years. Anyway, they put me in front of George, and George said, "Can you do this?" And he went. I said, "No, I can't do that." And Emil said, "That's too bad you can't do that because he won't hire a guy if he can't do that."
Oh.
Anyway, I didn't get it.
It was like a mini audition.
You're
right
the
there.
first person I told this story to, I
I'll
think.
be darned.
So I didn't get it, and I'm glad I didn't, because it would take me away again, and I was concentrating on getting my own thing going eventually. I got a job with a man called Calvin Jackson, who was a brilliant pianist. He was the assistant musical director of MGM with Johnny Green. Brilliant musician. And he had this job, very nice, sophisticated hotel in Toronto. He had a weekly radio series and a weekly television series. And he hired me to be a guest on the television series. He liked me so much, he asked me to join the quartet, which I did. And I went with him for about a year or so. And we played all the Eastern Seaboard, Chicago, Cleveland. We went to New York. And as a matter of fact, we were opposite Ella and Oscar in New York at the Basin Street, which is a great experience. It was run by a very, very nice man called Ralph Watkins. And some years later, after I left Calvin, he hired me to play the Embers in New York. And then Morris Levy asked me to do 15 weeks a year with my own group at the Round Table in New York.
Wow.
And I remember going back to see Ralph Watkins because he had Basin Street then. And Pops, Louis Armstrong, was there. And he said, "Have you ever met Mr. Armstrong?" I said, "No, I'd love to meet him." Oh, he said, "Come on, we'll take you to the dressing room." So he took me to the dressing room. He opened the door, and then here's Pops sitting there. He had just a pair of jockey shorts on, and he had a handkerchief on his head with each corner tied with a little knot, you know. And he was so nice to me and so encouraging. So that was a great experience, meeting him. And then, of course, at the Round Table, I worked opposite people like Andre Previn and all these major stars. And it was great, so I really did enjoy it. It was a great period of my life. And I still did a bit of traveling. And then one night, I looked down and there's Benny Goodman in the audience. And so I naturally played all the Goodman stuff, you know. So I went down afterwards and said, "Good evening, Mr. Goodman. I hope you're having a nice time." Anyway, that was about it. And so we went back, and 12 years later, 12 years. Now, Benny had a reputation of having a bad memory. He called everybody Pops, even his wife. But I can tell you for a fact, he didn't have a bad memory. And I'll explain that to you in a moment. Anyway, 12 years later, he came back to Toronto with Derek Smith to play a concert with the CBC Big Band, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And it was a great concert. I took this friend of mine, who was the critic for the Globe and Mail, the music critic, which is one of our big papers up there. And he played clarinet, you see. So at the end of the concert, he said, "Do you know Goodman?" I said, "No, I don't know him. He'd never remember me." I said, "He came to see me one night 12 years ago." He said, "Well, let's go backstage and see if we can get a few words from him for the column." I said, "Okay." So I go back, and the dressing room door is open, and here's Benny sitting with a bottle of a Mickey of black and white whiskey, Scotch whiskey, having a little taste. So he stops and he looks at me and he says, "Peter, how are you?" 12 years later. I said, "I'm fine, Benny." He said, "What are you doing up here?" I said, "Well, I live here, and I've got a group in the theater, the hotel, and I'm doing concerts, and I'm quite involved in studio work." I said, "What are you doing, Benny?" He said, "Oh, the odd bar mitzvah." Then he said, "No," he said, "we're going in the Rainbow Room in October." I said, "Are you using Vibes?" He said, "Why? Would you like to come?" I said, I'd come for union scale for you. He said, perfect. So about 2 weeks later, the phone rings and it's Goodman. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. I was just going off to do a television show with a country and western group, you know, the percussionist. Hello, Peter, this is Benny. I said, Benny Goodman. I said, oh, Benny, how are you? He said, fine. He said, we got a concert in Hackensack with Bucky Pizzarelli, Milt Hinton, Bobby Rosengarten, Zoot Sims, and Hank Jones, and myself. Can you come? I said, when is it? He said, so-and-so. I said, yeah, I can do it. That was the beginning of an 8-year association.
You drove from, was it Toronto you were in?
I was in Toronto.
Toronto to Hackensack.
He was the most encouraging and generous to me person that I've ever played for. Dick's very close. We have a different
Dick Hyman.
closeness. Dick and Julia are so beautiful people. But Benny encouraged me. I never got a Ray, although I got one mini Ray once, and it wasn't for playing. I stayed out for a day and a half. I had the time off, but the last time he saw me was leaving the Dorchester with Ava Gardner.
That got you the Ray?
I got me. I came back, and I'd only been. Where I was at the Dorchester, and he invited me to go to this party after the Royal Albert Hall. He said, "Come on over and come join us." I said, "Okay." And I was the only guy he used to invite. You know, he didn't invite everybody in the band. Just used to be me. I used to stay at his house in New York in the penthouse, and he'd leave me there, sleeping on the couch right next to the office with all the information. If I wanted to search through it, I could see all his business. Trusted me, you know. I never went anywhere near it. I did what I was supposed to do. Take me up to Connecticut to the house there and the farm he had, you know. And if he was going somewhere where we had to drive, he'd call me to drive him. And then afterwards, he would, we'd go out to eat together, you know. Anyway, went to the Dorchester, and I'm getting my fill of lobster and whatever, and this very familiar voice that I couldn't recognize for a moment, lady, said, "Mr. Appleyard, we were at the concert tonight. We enjoyed you so much. Would you like to join us for dinner?" Turned around, it was Ava Gardner. I thought about it for about 10 seconds, and I said, "Sure, I'd love to." So we go to the table, and she's with the major film producer, and so we started to have a dinner together, and I tried to get her to have a drink. She wasn't drinking, so I had a glass of wine, I think, and then finally she said, "Let's get out of here and go and hear some jazz." So we went over to Ronnie Scott's, and everybody knew her. She was a real jazz fan. Blossom Dearie was playing. She didn't like Blossom Dearie. But that guy, I can't never remember his name. He's a drummer. He had a flute in the band and a cello.
Chico Hamilton?
Chico Hamilton, good. Yeah, Chico. She knew Chico's.
Oh.
So we hung out. And so now it's about 3 in the morning. So let's go back to my place. How am I going to handle this? What kind of a line I'm going to have with Ava Gardner, you know? The first thing she did, walks in her apartment, or house it was, she put on Duke. And she's dancing to Duke, you know. Oh, gee. So now it's getting kind of late. After about 2 hours, the maid comes down and joins us. And she said, "Oh, I guess it's getting to be bedtime." I said, "Ava, I have to go." And she said, "What?" Probably the first time in my life any guy split after being with her all night. I said, and I was going through hell with my wife at home, bad divorce. But I wanted to be straight, and I thought, don't come on to Ava Gardner. She'll appreciate all the more if you don't, I'm sure. And I'm sure she did. She did appreciate it. So she said, okay. And she went in the back, came back with some sugar tablets that she had, over-the-counter things. She said, on this tour with Benny, she said, you're going to be tired a couple of times. Took a couple of days to give you a bit of energy. You know? So she takes me outside and puts her arm around me and kisses me goodnight and gives me her card. She said, please call me when you come back to London. So I had to go up to Grimsby to visit that lovely little girlfriend I had. And she was remarried and all that sort of stuff. I went to visit them, and so I came back, and I'd been legitimately off, you know. And so Muriel Zuckerman, who was Benny's secretary, was waiting for me in the lobby of the hotel. She said, where have you been for the last couple of days? I said, well, I went up to Grimsby, and she said, Mr. Goodman has been looking for you, and here he is now. And he had a ray on. So the first thing I said to him, Benny, don't look at me like that. I don't want a ray. He had the blackest of eyes that scared the hell out of the devil. Anyway, he said, where have you been for the last 36 hours? I said, I went up to Grimsby to visit the last time I saw you, you were leaving with Ava Gardner. I said, no, I was there a good part of the night. I said, but I left and went on the train up to Grimsby to visit some relatives and that. He said, don't you ever leave this tour without me knowing exactly where you are. I walked away. So I turned to Muriel, I said, Muriel, what was that all about? I'm 40 years old, you know. She said, he wanted to take you to the Ritz for dinner last night, and you weren't there, so he had to eat alone. But he was, I really liked him. I could read him. And if I saw there was a mood there, I wouldn't go anywhere near him. When he came to Toronto to play with the big band, I arranged the accommodation at this lovely hotel that I stayed at, and they gave him Pierre Trudeau's, our former Prime Minister's, penthouse suite for nothing for the week. And I have an old Silver Cloud Rolls Royce, and I drove him to work every night in the Rowe, you see, and then his daughter came, Benji, who was a lovely girl, and I picked them up and took her, brought him from the airport and all that sort of stuff.
Wow.
Anyway, a couple of weeks later, we were playing in Ames, Iowa, and he called me, so you busy, so-and-so? I said, no, why? He said, we got this concert in Ames, Iowa. It's nothing. He said, it's just a concert, but I'd like you to do it, you see. So I get up to Ames, Iowa, and it's one of these huge hockey rinks, about 7,000 people there. He said, it's nothing. The New York Philharmonic, conducted by Andre Kostelanetz.
In Ames, Iowa.
And Benny playing the Weber Clarinet Concerto with 7,000 people waiting to hear Honeysuckle Rose. It was incredible. So after we finished that night, he said, let's go and get something to eat. So I said, okay. So we went off to get something to eat, and I was having some apple pie. So he reached over, he said, let me try a piece of that. So he took, oh, that's good. He said, oh, by the way, he said, this is for you. It was a jewelry box. I said, what's this for, Benny? He said, that's for your hospitality in Toronto. Open it. I opened it, and it was a pair of hand-sculpted nugget solid gold cufflinks, which I had appraised recently, and the guy said, at Tiffany's, he said, today, $3,000 or $4,000. Ask him for a raise, you go insane. You go insane. We were going to Europe, and I was in the apartment, and he was paying me, I forget what it was, $500 for the week or something. Of course, this was in 1973 or 74. We were to do 5 concerts, you know. I said, Benny, I can't go for that money. He said, well, what do you mean you can't go for that money? I said, well, I'll make that money in the studios for a couple of days, and I don't have to. He said, you should be with me at all these major concert halls throughout Europe. I said, but Benny, I need more money. And, I can't, we give you, oh dear, finally. He said, all right, I'll pay you the same as I'm paying Zoo Sims. I said, good. It was $100 more. So then he said, let's go out to eat and celebrate. So he took me to, I think it's called the Century Club. It's on 5th Avenue. And the list of members is like John D. Mellon, George D. Rockefeller, blah, 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 Benny Goodman. You know. So we get there, and it was incredible. He said, Do you like it? I said, oh, Benny, it's just incredible. This all beautiful panel, you know. It's like a movie, isn't it? I said, yeah. So the waiter came to me, Mr. Goodman, what would you like tonight? Well, he said, the roast beef. Do you like roast beef, Peter? I said, yeah, I do. He said, well, we had that roast beef the last time, prime rib. Do you have some? He said, whoa, do we have some tonight? Really, Black Angus. Good. And by the way, that wine that we had the last time, what was it? It was, and this is 72, 73. He said, yes, Mr. Goodman, it was a Chateau Latour. I think it was 60. He said, bring a bottle of that. And I looked at the menu. It was like $500 for the bottle. I felt like saying, Benny, I'd
I'll
rather
take
have the
that
money.
my salary.
Anyway, he took me downstairs, and we were leaving, and I smoked a pipe in those days, and he stopped me, just a minute. And he said, give me some tobacco, please, Dunhill, Mr. Appleyard.
Well, he operated on his own terms, didn't he? You know, to be generous or to be the typical Benny.
Once he said to me, why do you take so many pictures? I have a Leica, you see, and I took a lot of pictures. I said, it's my hobby, Benny. He said, if you ever take any of me and sell them, let me know. He wanted the money.
Wow.
So anyway, a couple of years ago, I was in this second-hand shop which a friend of mine used to run, and he had a trade paper. Oh, he said there was an auction of musicians' artifacts in New York by Sotheby's. He said, this stuff of Benny Goodman's. This hat, he showed me a picture of it, and I knew what it was, because I recognized the hat. And a pair of shoe trees, and a photograph of Benny and his daughter sold for $1,750. I'd taken the photograph.
Is that right?
So I looked to heaven and I said, Benny, finally, I didn't get the money. Somebody got $1,750 for one of the photographs. I'd taken it in Copenhagen when we were there.
Oh, darn.
Playing the Tivoli Gardens.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bucky was with us quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Bucky was one of his favorites.
Yeah. Why would a musician be his favorite? Were you able to figure that out? Yeah, I mean,
I really don't know. Bucky had a very nice personality, and his wife was very lovely.
yeah.
I don't know. Because the one European tour that we did, Bucky was on guitar. He never gave him one solo the whole tour. Just time.
Well, conversely, why would he fire somebody at a moment's notice? Why, do you know?
Well, sometimes people would take him to task. I never really saw him lose his temper. But Hank Jones was my favorite pianist. I mean, he was so beautiful. Incredible player. Dick Gill's the same way. On that record, you know, he's on that record that I sent you.
Yeah.
He was booked to be with us at some special function for the government and didn't show up. He told Benny that he'd been held up at the George Washington Bridge. Couldn't make it. Benny called the New York Port Authority and found out there was no holdup at the bridge that day. So the next time he came on the stage, Benny took him to task, and they started to fight on the stage. Not physically, but Hank was very genteel and very proper, and he was cursing at Benny, you know. So he walked on the stage. Benny never used him again. But on 3 occasions, I booked Hank Jones. He didn't show up.
No kidding.
The record I made over in Barbados was done with Bucky, Major Hawley, Butch Miles, Rick Wilkins on tenor, and myself, without the piano. He was booked to play in Barbados. They even rented a German Steinway for him. And I called him 2 nights before we were to go. I said, he was at Carnegie Hall with Ella. I said, Hank, we've got a room at the hotel, at the airport, then on the night before the flight, we'd like you to be there with us so we can all leave early in the morning. And, oh, I'll be there. He said, what kind of shoes do you want me to wear? I said, I don't care if you come in your bare feet, but be there. Oh, I'll be there. He didn't show up.
Wow.
So we get to Barbados, I had to make excuses for him, and so we called him back again. And I said, what happened? He said, I forgot my passport. So then he said, well, I'll be on the plane tomorrow. So we drove all the way across the island, 2-hour drive, to pick him up. Didn't show up. So I called him again. I said, Hank, what are you doing? Oh, he said, I didn't like the attitude of the clerk.
He said what? I didn't follow you.
He didn't like the airline's clerk, so he said.
Dear.
So then he said, my friend said he would send a private plane to pick him up in Albany and fly him down to Kennedy, and he didn't show up.
Yeah.
I get to Switzerland. I book him in Switzerland to play with us. No Hank Jones. Hank, what happened? Oh, my car broke down on the way to the airport. Oh, Hank, you know.
I'll be darned.
Anyway, he finally showed up. And strangely enough, I booked him before in Toronto, and he did show up again. He claimed he couldn't get out of here, New York, for the weather. And I got this guy, Ian Barge, to sub. So, with the thing in Switzerland, it so happened that Ian was working there, and he said, what happened? Did Hank Jones show up? Oh. So, now, in Barbados, I'm stuck. We had 4 days' grace to get a pianist. I called John Bunch, and John said, what happened? Didn't Hank Jones show up? Yeah.
No.
I said, how did you know? He said, I knew about the gig. He said, I can't come, I'm busy. And we had a snowstorm in Canada. I couldn't get my Canadian pianist down. So we had to do the gig without him. But fortunately, we had Bucky. The reason he was booked, the guy wanted him, of course, to play, Jones, but he'd made a record with Ernestine Addison, and she was on the gig with us. So we had to accompany Ernestine without piano.
Mm.
He was the greatest pianist that, well, he was another Dick Hyman of that caliber, Oscar Peterson caliber, but he had that reputation,
I'll be darned.
which was so sad.
I
Because
didn't know that. You know, he lived like an hour south of here.
He did, yeah.
In Oneonta,
He had
New
a
York.
farm, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
Yeah, because but these people that are coming, I hope, tomorrow night, from Chase
Okay.
Design,
Yeah.
Dave Chase was a frustrated vibraphone player.
Oh.
And every year, for about 5 years, he would get me to hire 6 or 5 of the leading jazz players in America.
Mm-hmm.
I had every one of them playing there in Skinny Atlas for this. He had a barn party in his barn, and Hank came and played. And so David said, well, what do you want? So he said, I've just bought this farm. I'd like to have a horse. Well, David had a lot of polo ponies. You know, he was a polo player, David Chase.
Oh.
He said, well, I can give you a retired polo pony. He said, that'd be perfect. He never picked it up. He was just one of a kind. But
Yeah.
we made a record when we were there. We made this record of it was a recording done by the Swiss government. You know, video and audio.
Yeah.
And it was Hank Jones, Slam Stewart, Jerry Fuller, wonderful drummer from Canada, and myself. And unfortunately, the guy in Switzerland will not release it.
Not
I
give
don't
it
know
up.
why.
Yeah.
After all these years,
Right.
this is like 40 years ago, you know.
Yeah.
And this chap I've been in touch with is writing a book on Slam Stewart. And he knew about this date. And he wrote to this guy and said, could you tell me what the tunes were that you played, etc.? And are you ever going to release that record? It was a wonderful record. Well, how can you go wrong with Slam Stewart and Hank Jones?
Yeah.
You know. Anyway,
Well,
that's how we roll.
before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you a question I've been thinking about. regarding the vibes. If I went to a set of vibes and pushed down the pedal and hit a note with a mallet, and then you went to the vibes and hit it, would it sound that much different?
Yeah.
Well, why?
It's like with the touch of a pianist.
Mm-hmm.
You can have Oscar Peterson sit at a Steinway and play a little bit, and then you'd have Dick Hyman do it, or Teddy Wilson, or Billy Charlap. It all sound different.
Mm.
It's the touch. And it's the same with the mallet. Hampton used to play very softly, but with very hard mallets.
Oh.
I use sort of a medium mallet, and at times I can be a little aggressive because the music inspires you, you know. I don't like to play too hard because then there's a limit as of how much volume you can get.
Mm-hmm.
But it's Hampton and I did a television show together. I had a television series that I was the host of, and he came as a guest. And he played first of all, and then we got together and we did 7 Come 11 together. And I gave him my instrument, and I had another instrument. He picked up my mallets, he started to play. That's Lionel Hampton. You could hear it right away. Red Nova was another one. Red Nova played so beautifully, very low with the mallets. Never looked at the keyboard.
Oh.
He could play like this. I used to impersonate these guys. I had a little act. And I used to say, I used to wonder what he was looking for, and I think it was for a chick, you know. Hey, you and me tonight.
What did
Cal
you...
Jada was another one that inspired me,
Hmm.
told me I should go to New York. It was
Uh-huh.
Cal. And he would lovely sound. Johnny Ray, this other vibraphone player with Shearing,
Hmm.
and Emil. They all had their own particular sound, and it always amazed me that it varied. And it was the same with pianists. You know, I can play a run, and Oscar could be right beside me, and it would sound completely different.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the weight, the pressure, I guess, and what he hears, that sound.
Well, that's a good answer because, you know, you would think that, well, a wind instrument, it might be easier to get your own identifiable sound on
Yeah.
a wind instrument. I guess there's more things that you can vary, but to your ears, it's the same as for the vibes.
I can pretty well tell the type of instrument that they're playing.
Hmm.
Through the years, I've
Yeah.
become so accustomed to that particular timbre of that instrument.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, I'm suffering with a hearing loss like we all do.
Hmm.
Red could barely hear. You have to yell at him, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Ham, too, was suffering. But practicing the vibes every day, which I've done all my life, you're exposing yourself to this sound. My specialist told me that if you use an electric toothbrush every day, it deteriorates the hearing.
Yeah. What was the racial attitude like in Canada? Was it any different towards African American musicians, or was it good, bad, or indifferent?
When?
I guess I'm thinking of when you first got there, or maybe in the 60s especially.
Fortunately for me, I grew up in a small English town, and there was no prejudice. The first black person I saw was a soldier that my father brought for dinner during the war. I revered them because of my knowledge of Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton, Charlie Christian, Louis Armstrong. The man that inspired me to play jazz, first of all, was Coleman Hawkins. And to me, they were gods, basically. I didn't know anything about prejudice. But there was a theory in New York at that time in the 60s that, though I didn't live there per se, so I didn't experience it, but there was some kind of prejudice. did they call it Uncle Tomism or something, or Tom Uncle?
Uncle Tom is a term. Are you talking about prejudice against white jazz musicians? Yeah, that you weren't authentic, that what you played couldn't be as good as a black musician.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, there was some of that historically, I guess.
Yeah, I never experienced it. I've always had wonderful reception and encouragement from musicians. I traveled with an all-black rhythm section in the 50s from Canada. A wonderful pianist called Ray Downs, Archie Lane, a drummer, and Bill Brito, a bass player. I used to stay in black hotels in Detroit and Chicago to be with them.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to be apart and make them feel uncomfortable. And but it was prejudice. There was definite prejudice in those days.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't easy for any of the black people, was it?
No. But when in Toronto or where you lived, when the black musicians came up there, was it? Did they have issues?
This man Calvin Jackson was Afro-American,
mm-hmm.
and was immediately accepted for his talent. He was an incredible arranger. He did a lot of the music in the American in Paris, I think, and some of these major MGM productions with Johnny Green, and an incredible soloist. He'd rather studied at Juilliard with degrees and what have you, and consequently he had incredible technique, classical and jazz. He was more of a classically orientated player,
mm-hmm.
but still could play. And the changes that he used to play were so just gorgeous.
No.
Yeah, and he was accepted. He had his own radio show. He was doing a television show weekly, 1 week with a big band, then with a small group. And we had all the guests. We had Ella there, and all kinds of people. Then he used to arrange for 3 or 4 of the major television shows, and so there was no prejudice there. There weren't that many black players in Canada. Not at that time. Archie Lane was one prominent one. Very good drummer. He's still around. Bill Brito traveled, and Ray Downs is teaching at Concordia University. Played a lot like Oscar. And with Oscar, of course, he suffered with the prejudice thing. He told me once he went to get his hair cut in Hamilton, the guy wouldn't cut his hair.
Amazing. You mentioned doing some studio work over the years. Do you have any particular things that you remember from your studio work, either wonderful or ridiculous?
I recorded for Maurice Jarre, who did Dr. Zhivago and all those films. I recorded for the greatest orchestrator I think ever lived, Robert Farnon.
Mm-hmm.
I did Sporky and Bess. I did for Oscar Peterson, the Canadiana Suite. That was a highlight as a percussionist.
Mm-hmm.
I did Henry Mancini. I remember Mancini coming over to me and said, "No, I don't want to play. I want you to do it like this," and he picked them out. And then I did, I recorded with Anne Murray, Gordon Lightfoot. Oh gosh, I can't remember them all. I recorded with Mel Torment, as Buddy Rich used to call
Mel
him.
Torment.
Yeah, Mel Torment. I traveled with him to Japan and played Michael's Pub with him for a month in New York. And we recorded in Tokyo. That was a great experience, working with him. He wasn't that generous with the money, but musically it was most gratifying. I enjoyed that.
Maybe he learned that from Benny Goodman.
And then, whilst I was with Benny, in New York, Mr. Sinatra was going to have a show for 2 weeks at the Euros Theatre with Ella Fitzgerald and the Basie Band and a huge string section. And I went down to buy tickets, and I couldn't get any. They were sold out. So I went over to Manny's music shop and I ran into Irv Kotler, his drummer.
Who was it?
Irv Kotler. In Manny's
Oh, Irv
music
Kotler,
shop.
yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
very good drummer. He was with
Yeah.
Frank for all
Yeah.
those great years. And he said, Peter, how are you? I said, fine, Irv, how are you? He said, good. He said, we were talking about you last night. I said, who, me? Who? He said, Bill Miller, Frank's
Yeah.
pianist, and Frank and me. I said, what are you talking about me for? He said, well, Frank wants to use vibes of the Euros. And Bill Miller said, well, why don't we get Peter Appleyard? So Frank said, Peter Appleyard? He said, yeah. He said, he works with Benny. He said, if he works with Benny, get him. I got the job without an audition.
I guess you solved that problem of not being able to get tickets for the show.
My wife came down and sat no one else could sit in the audience, just one person. And she sat there and heard Frank rehearse with us.
Oh, I see.
At the end of the run, on the second day he came up to me and he said, Peter, I owe you an apology. I said, what? Frank Sinatra. I said, what for? He said, there's not enough for you to play. He said, but sweetheart, if you feel like playing behind me or Ella, do it. At the end of the run, he gave us a party like he wouldn't quit on stage with the most beautiful wine and Italian food. Gave me a sterling silver jewelry box engraved Peter, thanks, FS. He was a great guy, generous man.
Right.
Of all the people have asked me, if you wanted to relive 2 weeks of your life or a week in music, which week would you choose? And I think it would be those 2 weeks with him.
Right.
I used to sit on the stage, Monk. They do Ladies of Tramp to Finish, you know, he and Ella with the Basie band. You're Ella, you're Basie, and facing the other way, and I'm this close to you. And there's reams of music, and Basie's looking and going, clink, you know. Thanks. I get too hungry, and Basie goes, boom, boing, bum, bum. All this music. So finally one night, Frank's saying, I get too hungry for dinner at 8, and Basie goes, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And Sinatra turns around and said, Bill, be careful, you might get a hernia. But, he was so great. And of all the people I've ever spoken to, and I played and met the Queen Mother twice, no one gave me the sensation that I experienced with Frank Sinatra. He had the most beautiful face to look at him, beautiful teeth, and you think you've seen blue eyes, you've never seen blue eyes like those. But the speaking voice, it was like he was singing to me, you know. He would come over occasionally and say, how's everything going, you know. And then one night, Benny came, and this is one to prove to you, Benny had a good memory. We had dinner beforehand, Benny and I. He came to the theater to hear Frank, you see. And he also wrote the letter to the government on my behalf to get me permission to work with him for 2 weeks. Which, once you saw Benny Goodman sing, I wish I'd got a copy of that letter. It was really something. Anyway, Benny said to me, who's playing the piano for Frank? I said, it's Bill Miller. Bill Miller. Oh. Yes, he said, Bill Miller. Yes, Bill Miller. Yes, did a couple of charts for the band. I said, oh, did he? He said, say hello tonight for me. I said, okay. So I get to work. I said, Bill, I just had dinner with Benny, and he told me that you wrote a couple of charts for the band. So Bill said, no, I never wrote for the band. My God, he said, 1935, when I was at high school. I remember now. Benny remembered all that way back.
That's great.
Something else. Anyway, that night, Benny was suffering with his slip disc. He had a bad slip disc, as you know. And the next night, Frank came up to me and he said, Peter, he said, Benny came last night, didn't come back and say hello. I said, no, Frank, he enjoyed the show so much, but he was in such pain. And then he opened up to me, Frank did, about the big band era and what it was like and how tough it was for those band leaders. He said, I really had great respect for them. He said, because we'd be traveling on buses with broken seats and engines that kept breaking down, and we'd do 64 consecutive one-nighters. And then he got talking about watching Tommy breathing.
Yeah.
You know all that about the circular breathing. And
Right.
Tommy about the way he used to swim a lot underwater. And it was really wonderful because they ask you not to bother him if he came on stage. 9 times out of 10, he would be in the wings, digging basically. He'd say, "Shiny stocking, shiny stocking." And then some nights, they'd open up the band, the bass would open, and Sinatra would be conducting. And people didn't know who it was until he turned around, you know. Then one night he saw the music stands and he said, "CB" on there. He came out and said, "Charlie Barnett."
Man, you've got a million of stories, and I wish we could keep going. We're about to run out of
Well, it was
the
great
film
talking to
here.
you.
I enjoyed it so much, and I'm looking forward to hearing you play tomorrow night.
Oh, thanks.
And
I'm looking forward to playing.
yeah, and
Great pleasure to be here.
wish your wife a happy birthday for me.
Oh,
understand-
thanks. That's nice of you.
Yeah,
I took her out for dinner. Huh?
good.
We had a lovely dinner, and we saw 4 Italian singers, young boys, about a year ago on the network that's doesn't have commercials. What's that called? That commercial?
PBS station.
Yeah,
Okay.
and they were great. They really were. And I really liked them too. They sang a lot of the old Italian songs, but their harmony was beautiful. Presentation was marvelous. So we sent away I did for the video. It was $100. You know, it was one of those kind of things. You join the club and pay $100 or whatever it was. And it never came. So she got on the phone. It was a DVD. Got on the phone and, "Oh yes, but we had a mix-up," and blah. It went on and went on. Anyway, it arrived about 2 months ago, and I didn't say anything about it. So she keeps saying to me, when are you going to give me your numbers of your credit card so I can? I said, "Oh, I keep remembering. I forget." Anyway, I had it as a surprise gift.
Excellent.
Plus, I gave her some American funds that I had.
All
Because
right.
she's got a daughter that works for one of the major stores in America as an accountant. She's very good. And they've just moved it to Dallas, so I said, "Here's some Dallas money for me."
Great. Good. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate
It's lovely being here. Thanks for inviting me.